We will now proceed with the questions on the history of WTO law and generally international trade regulations and international economic regulations. Frankly, I'm not going to talk much about the ancient times, prehistoric times, Mesopotamia and Egypt, even medieval times, and even the advent of the first trade agreements, because all of that is perfectly available to you in your reading materials and in the book by Peter van den Bosch. So should you be interested more in the historic background of the development of international economic and trade law, please consult the reading. We will now focus more on the more modern processes, and I will try to give you some of the flavor of things that happened after the Second World War, mainly and through the second half of the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century. I will also mention some of the processes that were ongoing. So as for the introduction of the modern international trade regulation, we should go back to the times of the Second World War, just shortly after the Second World War. And you might have heard of the famous Bretton Woods system, Bretton Woods institutions, and the conference itself that gave the name to the system, the Bretton Woods system, happened in July 1944. And it was the conference that actually established the new post-war monetary order, linking currencies, exchange rates to gold. And it was actually effective till 1971, when the US left this system and unbundled the US dollar and gold, actually. But we also know that it was the first time that rules and institutions to regulate international monetary system have been developed internationally by a huge accord of the so-called allies. The Soviet Union representatives attended the conference, but later they declined to ratify the final agreement. And here you may see the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Actually, until these days, it's a popular resort, a lovely place. But the only thing that made it so famous was the conference in 1994, the UN conference on monetary and financial development of the world after the Second World War. So when we talk of the Bretton Woods institutions, we usually refer to, and well, general public opinion refers to three institutions. Here are the images of their headquarters. I don't know if you managed to recognize any of those. It could be a good guesswork, but if you don't recognize the buildings, then I will help you. So what are the so-called Bretton Woods institutions as they are understood internationally? So the first institution that is clearly very well known is the IMF, International Monetary Fund. The second institution, the picture in the middle, it's the headquarters of the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods Conference established the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which is the major investment arm, development investment arm of the World Bank today. And the third picture to the right is the one that is the building of the William Rappert Center in Geneva, and that is the modern building of the World Trade Organization. Though actually there are very many caveats with respect to the correctness of this third organization being here in this picture. But let's now take it for granted that these three are the Bretton Woods institutions, and let's very briefly touch upon the competences of each of the three organizations. So the International Monetary Fund has as its fundamental mission ensuring the stability of international monetary system. And it actually does it in three ways. On the one hand, it keeps track of the global economy and the economies of member countries. It's a big think tank and a big analytical institution, and a lot of very useful analysis is available on their website. Secondly, and most importantly, their function is to provide lending to countries that have balance of payment difficulties. So countries that have critical shortages of monetary reserves that cannot pay off their debts, and they can help those governments. And then the third aspect of their work is to give practical help to members in the forms of capacity development, training, advisory to governments, and so on. So the IMF was one of the institutions that was clearly created at the Bretton Woods conference. The second institution that was created was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The International Bank until today exists. It's a global development cooperative that is actually owned by 189 members. And it is the largest development bank in the world, meaning it can provide financing to development projects, infrastructure projects, construction of electropower plants, reconstruction of critical infrastructure, mainly lended to countries that are not that developed and that need additional support for their projects. It supports the World Bank Group's mission generally in providing not only loans, but guarantees, risk management programs, advisory services to middle income and low income countries. And as well as it coordinates the responses to regional and global challenges that these developing countries are facing. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development is effectively, as I said, the lending arm of the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group is a family of 5 international organizations that, in particular, the bank makes loans to developing countries. And the third pillar in this building is the World Trade Organization, or better said, International Trade Organization in the times of the Bretton Woods Conference. But now we don't have any international trade organization. We only have the World Trade Organization, who has certain connection with the ITO, but we will talk about that in more detail later on. Actually, the very strange aspect of the relationship between the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO is that they are officially deemed to be Bretton Woods institutions, though it is not a historically accurate title. Because IMF and the World Bank were the only 2 institutions that actually emerged from the UN Monetary and Financial Conference in the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944. The conferences that produced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the failed charter of the International Trade Organization were held later on in London and in Havana. And the application of the title of the Bretton Woods Institution to the World Trade Organization is not entirely historically correct. But actually it makes certain sense because it looks more like a nod to the original concept, forming 3 pillars of the international economic order, and especially emphasizing that none of these institutions are formally part of the system of the United Nations. The IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO are not UN agencies. They are independent international organizations, and they are therefore having their own individual standing in the international economic regulation and management. So the Bretton Woods Conference, 1944, created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, International Trade Organization was, as I said, launched a little later. The International Trade Organization Preparatory Committee was actually established in February 1946, and the committee first met in London in October of the same year, and then held conferences in Geneva in the months from April to November 1947. So the 1947 Geneva meeting was actually a very elaborate conference which was pursuing three parallel goals, three major parts. So one part of it was devoted to the preparing the charter of the new international organization, the institution, and understanding how the organization will function. And this charter would contain a lot of very ambitious and very far-reaching obligations in the field of international economic order. The second part of negotiations was focused more on the mutual reduction of tariffs, import duties, so that the parties to this new organization would agree to get rid of protectionism in the field of high import duties, reducing them as much as they could. And the third part was devoted to the general clauses and obligations relating to this tariff reduction. And as for the delegates of the Soviet Union, they supported the initial resolutions passed in London, but actually they never attended, even I would say they before London conference, they supported the idea of creating the organization. They supported the initial resolution, but already in London they didn't show up. They didn't attend the subsequent conferences in Geneva and Havana. And the reason is quite clear, because the Soviet Union could not have been expected to be interested in the goals of the new organization. The communist doctrine actually stressed the necessity of self-sufficiency and import substitution. It was against increasing imports and against building up the global trading network. And the Soviet economic policy was directed towards different ends, therefore. We could not expect the Soviet Union to be enthusiastic about preserving private entrepreneurship, maintaining full employment in the US and the other Western countries, because those were the two indirect goals which were actually underlying the American desire to expand multilateral trade, so that to support domestic employment. So negotiations advanced pretty well in Geneva, and by October 1947, the negotiators managed to reach the agreement on items 2 and 3. Whereas it was clear that the charter of the new organization requires further work to be done, and it was clear it would not be finished before 1948. And although the GATT, originally the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which covers items 2 and 3, was intended to be made part, to be annexed to the Havana Charter, actually the negotiators had the feeling that it was not possible to wait until the ITO Charter was finished. They were afraid of losing the agreement that has been reached for various reasons, and then it would take a lot of time to have it ratified and approved in their capitals back home. So it was decided by 8 parties to sign the Protocol of Provisional Application of the agreement called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade 1947, so that it comes into effect provisionally before the final text of the Havana Charter gets actually approved and settled. The tricky thing is that those 8 countries were actually the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And then they were actually followed by the other 23 countries that had negotiated, and this protocol came into force. So the agreement called the GATT 1947 became effective as of 1948 already. And in March 1948, the negotiations of the WTO Charter were successfully completed in the city of Havana, Cuba. So why have they chosen such a place for negotiations? Currently, it seems a little strange and unclear, but we should keep in mind that the socialist revolution in Cuba started much later, well, not much later, 5 years later. In 1953, the new socialist government was finally established only in 1958. So the U.S. property was nationalized by Castro only in 1960. Leading to all the further crises that happened in bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States. In the times of 1948, Havana was, as it is very close to the territory of the United States, was full of American cars, hotels, casinos, owned by the US citizens, by foreign nationals, and it was one of the places which was perfectly available to the US citizens during the dry law. When they could not get alcohol in the US, they would go and get rum in Havana, in Cuba. So that is the photo of the Havana conference actually happening March 1948. And interestingly, the Havana Charter, which was signed by 56 countries on the 24th of March 1948, unfortunately never, or maybe fortunately now, it's difficult to say, it never came to existence. The Havana Charter was an extremely ambitious document, and I think until today it remains one of the most ambitious documents at all ever developed in the field of international economic regulation. It covered not only questions of trade, but it would touch upon the matters of investment, labor, and competition. And some of the matters which have been touched upon in the Havana Charter, which have been addressed in the Havana Charter, do not have much of adequate international regulation until today. Well, I could mention the questions of labor rights, some of the questions of competition policies, employment, inflation, deflation, commodity agreements. Many of those matters until today remain not properly covered by international trade law. And that was one of the clear reasons why Havana Charter never came to existence. The photo you see on this slide, maybe you recognize this gentleman, that is Harry Truman, the 33rd US president. He was the president from 1945 to 1953. And he implemented the Marshall Plan that you have heard about to rebuild the economy of the Western Europe. He established the Truman Doctrine, the NATO. So quite an influential guy. As for Truman, he repeatedly submitted the Havana Charter of 1948 to the US Congress to have it approved, but it never got approved. And in 1951, he just eventually decided that he would no longer seek any congressional approval of the charter, and therefore the WTO Charter was left without the participation of the United States. You understand the time of international trade shortly after the Second World War. You understand that no comprehensive international organization could exist in those days without the participation of the United States, given that the Soviets did not participate at all. So still the Havana Charter, I highly invite you to go and look through it. It's an interesting document, not only in the historical perspective, because for some of the questions of the interpretation of WTO law of the GATT, for instance, we have to get back to the text of the Havana Charter to understand the structure of the obligations. Many of the provisions from the Havana Charter were incorporated into the text of the GATT, but then the structure changed, for instance, and in the same interpretation of the interplay between articles, say 21 and 24 of the GATT, the list of exceptions in Article 24.8 of the GATT, reference to the Havana Charter would make things much clearer. So this is as for the Havana Charter, unfortunately or fortunately left abandoned, and the provisional application of the GATT that started in 1947 remained until 1995. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is actually an international treaty. It's not an international organization, and it matters because we do not refer to members of the GATT. We say contracting parties, and when reading the text of the GATT, you will see the reference to the term contracting parties. The reason is straightforward, because it was not an international organization. It was an international treaty, but it was immediately clear that this treaty requires some administration because it is the forum for trade negotiations, and therefore there is a need for secretariat for the WTO, for the GATT, for the international treaty. So it was just a treaty with a secretariat attached to it, located in Geneva, Switzerland. And from 1947 until 1995, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was used as a platform for 8 rounds of trade negotiations that were going on. Since 1977, this building of the Center of William Rappert in Geneva, right by the lake, Rue de Lausanne. Before 1977, this building belonged to the International Labour Organization, but when it moved to a different building, this building was given to the Secretariat of the GATT in Geneva, and until today, that is the headquarters of the WTO. A very picturesque place, right near the lake, a big park surrounding it. So already since 1977, the GATT and the WTO remain in the same building, though actually new buildings are being constructed surrounding the main headquarters because the organization grows and the need for negotiation rooms also grows. Bear in mind that, again, the WTO is not under the auspices of the United Nations. And one important step came in 1951 when the contracting parties decided to finance the Secretariat of the GATT directly through their own contributions and not from funds provided by the United Nations. And one more important thing that I need to mention is that within the GATT system, there was already a mechanism of dispute settlement. It was not ideal from the modern perspective, but it was very typical from the perspective of general public international law. The dispute could be referred to the contracting parties, so to all the members, to all the parties to this agreement. And the decision would be taken by all members by consensus. All of them should not object to the decision taken. Yes, the mechanism of dispute settlement could have been blocked, vetoed by one of the members, but still it was quite actively used because a big number of trade disputes, which we now take into account when reading WTO agreements, date back to the GATT times. So what are those 8 tariff rounds which I mentioned here on this slide? GATT was conceived as a framework for successive trade liberalization, for the mutual tariff reduction. There are provisions within the GATT that give you a clear understanding that there was a purpose of further reduction of tariffs. And the more tariffs are reduced, the more trade would be created between the parties to the GATT. So that was the idea. And the GATT itself provides for those obligations, the very basic obligations, to preserve those market access conditions and prevent circumvention of those tariff commitments. So in 1986, the round that was launched was called the Uruguay round, and negotiations were held from 1986 to 1994. And as a result of the Uruguay round, the WTO as an international organization comes to existence. So if the GATT is a relatively small document, so that is the book, which I have here. This is the book titled "The Results of the Uruguay Round of International Multilateral Trade Negotiations." The GATT occupies a very small portion of it. I could show you that it is maybe about 40, 50 pages only, with the rest being the documents that date back to 1995 and not 1947. These are the new disciplines that were developed so that to address concerns which were already clear in 1947 but were not covered for whatever reason by the GATT, or were not elaborately developed under the GATT rules, and therefore the whole complex of the Uruguay round agreements emerges from those disciplines of the GATT which needed further elaboration and clarification. WTO now gains a personality, legal personality, as an international organization, and it has a status of an international organization. It is regulated by the international rules on international organizations, and there are all the consequences of accepting it, legal consequences of accepting it as a legal personality, if we could call it this way. The Secretariat of the WTO is still in Geneva, Switzerland, same building. And the Secretariat is a relatively small, it is small for an international organization. We will mention it further down, but the Secretariat of the WTO in 2018 was only 627 people. That is not much. For an international organization, that is a very small number of employees. What happened with GATT 1947? The old agreement GATT 1947, which was perfectly functioning since 1947 till 1995, remained valid. So it was incorporated in the whole complex of rules of the Uruguay trade round. And it was incorporated through a document which is called GATT 1994, which actually makes it relevant. And there were certain additional clarifications added, certain additional understandings provided for, but GATT 1947 in the original text, with some minor additions that happened from 1947, remained relevant, and it regulates international trade until today. In that sense, we are lucky. Legal texts don't change that frequently, and that as much as it may happen in domestic legal systems. Then there was a completely new system of dispute settlement, which is very often called the jewel in the crown of the WTO, and that is correctly so, because that is the new system not based on consensus. And now it is a compulsory dispute settlement mechanism, which the respondent or the losing party cannot block. And it provides for certain compensation mechanism, for certain retaliation mechanism, the mechanism of so-called suspension of concessions, which we will talk about in more detail in this course. So what is the goal of the WTO, in addition to the work that was prepared by the GATT, is also to monitor national trade policies and review and give the picture of what is going on internationally in a given moment of time. And it still provides for further negotiation rounds and further liberalization, not only in the field of the reduction of tariffs, but also further development of a number of disciplines that were not agreed upon in 1995, by 1995. So it remains as a forum for negotiations. A lot of meetings happening in the WTO building daily. So as for the WTO functioning, a few words just to give you the understanding of the organization and what it currently does. We will go further in the next video to the questions of legal rules that are being applied by the organization. But here it is important to understand that the Secretariat in Geneva consists of three types of specialists, well, putting aside the technical support: economists, lawyers, and trade policy experts. For lawyers, they are not as many as you may expect. There are three big divisions where lawyers work: the Legal Affairs Division, the Rules Division, and the Appellate Body Secretariat where lawyers work. So I just took the figures from the WTO website as for the most recent report on the WTO functioning of 2019. 25 lawyers in the appellate body, 34 legal affairs, 31 rules division. So around 90 lawyers in total. That is quite interestingly, because when there is a vacancy opening, there are literally hundreds of applicants filing their applications. They're very competitive field, a very competitive sphere, and therefore, indeed, professionals of the very highest standards work there for the WTO Secretariat. The Secretariat, as I said, employs only about 600 people, a little more than 600 people, 625, 630. Those are contract employees, as we understand. Clearly, there are some interns, there are some temporary contract positions, but as for the long-term contracts, we have around only 600 employees of 84 members. So 84 members represented. There are certain procedures that try to achieve a maximum representation of all WTO members in the Secretariat. Well, compare it to the other international organizations, say of the UN framework, Food and Agriculture Organization, over 4,000 people. International Labour Organization, over 3,000 people. UN Refugee Agency, over 5,000 people. The IMF, which we mentioned, which is not part of the UN, but which is also dealing with the questions of international economic relations, over 2,500 people. So compared to these figures, WTO Secretariat is really very small. Secondly, the head of the Secretariat, the head of the administrative part of the functioning of the WTO is Director General of the WTO. They are chosen from the members. Currently, the Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, is from Brazil, and Roberto Azevedo has Deputy Directors Generals, and then we will see further the structure of the WTO bodies in the next lectures. But the head of the WTO, the Director General of the WTO, does not actually make any decisions. All decisions which are essential for international trade management and regulation would be only taken by members. But we will talk about that in more detail further down. How does the budget get formed? The budget of the WTO, as said, is formed through direct contributions by the WTO members, and the budget contribution shares are determined according to each member's share in international trade in a given year. So you can find all this information on WTO website, and you may see what is the overall figure of the budget of the WTO. You may see it's about 200 million Swiss francs, not that much for, again, said international organization of this scope and of this necessity in its functioning. The budget is split between members according to their shares of trade based on official statistics. Here are the rough figures. They are not entirely precise, but they could give you the general flavor of of how these contributions split between members in 2019. The major contributor was clearly the EU, not the EU itself, though EU is a member, but it's individual EU members that pay their parts of the contribution according to their individual shares. But in total, EU accounts for 34%, US 12%, China 10%, major individual economies, individual trading economies, Mexico, Canada, Australia, Japan, India, Russia, some figures for your interest, but should you wish to see all the details, go to the WTO website, see their annual report, and you will see the chapter on the budget and its allocation between the members. And the last but not least, the WTO is an international organization, as said, and certain staff members employ certain benefits and immunities as provided by international law, provided by the final act of the Uruguay round, and well, clearly as international bureaucrats, they are not subject to any income taxes on the territory of Switzerland, for instance. But there are some other immunities and privileges that would be granted in order to provide necessary independence of the international organization and to give them sufficient scope for their work. So that is how the WTO functions in general. And now I would be happy to invite you to discuss further the issues of WTO law and treaties that form part of the WTO legal system.